All right. So we gathered today to discuss the European Green Deal, to see whether it's a game changer in EU policy or just a buzzword. Before we start, just a few words about me. My name is Mario. No need to call me Mr. Mario. Only a few weeks ago, I received my PhD, also entirely online at the Central European University in Budapest. I teach at the University of Zagreb. I teach on public policy of the European Union, also statistics and qualitative methods and designs. I'm also a member of a non-governmental organization in Croatia, which is quite connected to today's topic. It's the organization called Sustainable Community Development, ODRAS, in Croatia, which is the first such NGO in Croatia dealing with sustainable development. I have a few words to say on this topic as well. I hope it will be helpful to you to gather your thoughts and ideas on how to create a social democratic green future. European Green Deal, everyone has heard about it. We can all agree that the name of the initiative sounds quite appealing. It's sketchy. It somehow draws and sounds American, almost like the Roosevelt's New Deal in the 30s, alike to the Green New Deal that has been discussed in the US just recently. But regardless of that, the context of this Green Deal, of this New Deal, is a bit different than the 30s. At least it was a few weeks ago. The context of the Green Deal is radically different in the sense that the EU economies were in full swing just a couple of months ago. The EU was recovering from the very severe euro crisis, from a very severe sovereign debt crisis, and European Union's new growth strategy, because that's the whole point of the Green Deal. It's not just an environmental initiative; it's something more. And we'll explore what it is. Next, after that, we'll scratch a bit underneath the surface of the Green Deal and see what the substance of the Green Deal is and what all the fuss is about. So what are the policy areas and initiatives that have been proposed currently by the European Commission? We'll then conclude with a bit of pessimism or optimism, depends on you as well and your contribution to the discussion today. We'll look at the challenges ahead. The challenge is big. It's called COVID-19, the Corona crisis. And we'll try to see, we'll try to map the current discussion and debate about that and see your opinions as well, whether you see it as a curse or as a blessing for the green transition. So let me start with briefly outlining contextualizing the European Green Deal and the wider political context of the European Union. You might know that last year we had the European Parliament elections. We had the so-called Spitzenkandidaten principle applied, whereby the European People's Party's Manfred Weber, which you can see here on your screen, was supposed to become the next European Commission president, but as we know, it failed. So the process was compromised. The expectation that the process would bring more democratic legitimacy to the whole process of EP election was somehow compromised, and it caused, to be frank, a lot of frustration, both with citizens, but also with other political parties and options, and as well then because Ursula von der Leyen was chosen by EU leaders to become the new candidate for the Commission president. The expectations were raised, not just among citizens, but also among other political parties. Also, we know that Ursula von der Leyen's candidacy was marked by controversy, also because she wasn't she didn't have that level of political legitimacy as maybe some would have expected to, and she felt that she had to cater to different interests in order to be elected Commission president. Among many other interests, she wanted to cater to the green cause as well, to the green agenda and to the cause of climate change and environmental concerns. Just when you think about it, the policy load, the policy problem that we had in the build-up to the EP elections was enormous. I mean, we had a very intensified debate on climate change and global warming, especially in the period after the Paris Agreement in 2015. We had an intense debate on the 2 degrees Celsius that we shouldn't stumble upon. We had the new green movement. We had Greta Thunberg. We had Fridays for Future events, and so on and so forth. So all of this, plus the fact that the outline of the new European Parliament was radically different from what was before, it all led to the von der Leyen candidacy and the future Commission to focus more on green causes, not to antagonize the Greens, Liberals, and Socialists in the European Parliament. And to be fair, Ursula von der Leyen, she won support of the European Parliament, but only by a very razor-thin majority. But maybe the fact that she rallied for the Green Deal amidst the vote and the EP maybe helped her to cater some votes. So she was in great need of a strong statement to show to the Greens that she was serious about the transformation of the European economy, society, and a better and a higher political attachment to the green cause. When it comes to the policy dimension, we talked now about the political dimension. Let's talk briefly about the policy dimension. The Green Deal as such, when we scratch beyond the surface, is not necessarily a new paradigm shift in the European Union. We know that, for a matter of fact, there's a long tradition of environmental policy in the European Union. Just think about it. There are numerous things that all of us encounter on a daily basis where the European Union had a great say on: air quality standards, the protection of biodiversity, CO2 emission standards in cars, the incentives to increase energy efficiency in our buildings, the environmental protection in agriculture. All of these areas have already been regulated by the European Union and European legislation. But in the last decade or so, the agenda has intensified. You can maybe remember of the Europe 2020 strategy, which was passed in 2010. It was then marked as a exit strategy from the crisis. EU was committed to achieving a smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. You remember the 2020 targets to increase to increase energy efficiency by 20% by 2020, to increase the consumption of renewable energy by 20%, and to reduce the carbon footprint, the carbon emissions by 20% as well. So that happened in 2010. Afterwards, already we had a clear commitment to a very integrated approach to climate change and environmental policy in 2014 with the 7th Environmental Action Program, which marked that shift in thinking, in a sense that we have to integrate all the environmental concerns in all other policy areas, not just in climate policy and in environmental policy. So we have to include environmental concerns in the way we think about energy policy, in the way we think about transport, mobility, in the way we create our agriculture, and the way we build our houses, and so on and so forth. So this was also reflected in the EU budget for 2014-2020, where it was settled that at least 20% of all the funding that goes to member state has to be climate-related expenditures. So again, we have a commitment to that here as well. But as I said, in that sense, the Green Deal is not a necessarily a paradigmatic shift from what we had before. In the last decade, there wasn't too much movement on environmental policy. The priorities were others, but this doesn't mean that there were no new initiatives growing and no new ideas coming out of the European Union. So just think about the all sorts of ideas like zero waste, circular economy, which we'll discuss, clean mobility. So these were all new ideas that popped up and were kind of building up pressure on the EU level, on the EU stage to raise the stakes in climate and environmental policy. So going to year 2019, we saw that as the European leaders gathered to rethink the future of the European Union for the next 5 to 10 years, we know the European Council is the one that sets the strategic pace of what's going on in the European Union. It gives a mandate to the Commission to come up with new initiatives. So the European Council sort of said that climate neutrality would be one of the 4 main priorities of the European Union in the next 5 years. I'll just read one small quote from their European Council conclusions in 2019, which will give a nice taste to it and show you what I mean. It says, as the effects of climate change become more visible and pervasive, we urgently need to step up our action to manage this existential threat. The EU can and must lead the way by engaging in an in-depth transformation of its economy and society to achieve climate neutrality. So you can see a lot of very strong words being said here, talking about existential threats. You can all, let me just check, I have some chatting. Yeah, you can get the presentation afterwards, of course. All right. So a lot of strong words saying, calling the climate crisis an existential threat to the European Union, calling upon a in-depth transformation of the economy and society, and achieving climate neutrality. These seem like very radical, very ambitious claims, and this was again then reflected in what the von der Leyen Commission came up with in the European Green Deal. So when you look at the program of the new Commission, the European Green Deal figures very highly. It's meant to be a new growth model for the European Union, and clearly the European Green Deal draws on or is motivated by, inspired by the evolution of political thinking in the European Parliament, but also by the European Council's strategic agenda 2019-2024. Exactly, there is a typo in the presentation. Thank you for noticing. So just to conclude this section, you can maybe see now from this perspective that we had basically a coupling of 3 things. We had a coupling of multiple streams here, a coupling of the problem load, which was perceived to be very high in terms of climate change, the urgency to act. On the other hand, we had the dimension of the political will. The political will was finally there on the highest political level to do something. And we had the policy dimension, which was already ready. So we had all the ideas and initiatives that came to fruition with the European Green Deal already pre-prepared in the build-up of the European Green Deal. So all 3 dimensions coupled, the window of opportunity opened, and the von der Leyen Commission took ownership of it. So that's how the European Green Deal came about. So let's talk business now. Let's talk about the substance of the European Green Deal, what it actually is. So in the view of the European Commission, the European Green Deal is supposed to be EU's response to the worsening climate and environmental crisis and challenges, and also the new instrument of the European Union to implement the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which you've probably heard of. So here's one depiction of what is meant by sustainable development, just to give you a heads up. Sustainable development here intends to bring into harmony three aspects of our life: the social, economic, and environmental. We want to achieve growth, but without depleting our nature's resources, and without giving a chance to the future generations to live an equally high quality life, and to live in a equitable society as well. The European Green Deal is basically at this point EU's new growth strategy. It's a flagship initiative, just like the Europe 2020 strategy was back in 2010. The European Green Deal sets out, in comparison to the last funding period, it sets out a goal of at least 25% of all EU funding coming out of different EU funds being funneled to the environmental cause, to the cause of sustainable development. This European Green Deal, basically what it does, it offers as we'll see, a comprehensive roadmap for a sustainable future. It shows in a very coherent way what it is that we have to do to achieve a climate neutral European Union by 2050. So that's the main thing that always pops up, and those of you who are unfamiliar or somewhat familiar with the European Green Deal, I'm quite sure that that's the buzzword that you've heard. Climate neutrality by 2050. That's the main thing. So the stakes are raised with the European Green Deal. Unlike previous periods, there is courage to talk about very serious and radical solutions. And there is a will to finally implement this paradigm shift, which has been going on for the last 10 years or so. It offers the Green Deal offers in an integrated way a view of how to integrate the environmental cause in different policy areas. It gives a much greater political clout to the whole cause, as I said earlier as well. And there is great hope with this initiative that we might achieve some sort of cross-fertilization and linkages between different policy fields, between issues of biodiversity, social policy, employment, technology, global action on the global stage, economic model, in industry, industrial change, agriculture, and mobility. So these are all issues that are in the Green Deal. They're intertwined. They work with each other. They all try to have the same baseline, which is mainstreamed throughout the whole, throughout every policy dimension in the European Union, that they all look forward to achieving a clean, sustainable future. So that's what the main message is. So talking about substance behind the Green Deal, there are four main pillars of the Green Deal that I'd like to emphasize here. The first pillar is, of course, always very much emphasized. It's the climate cause. That's the main concern, of course, to achieve zero levels of greenhouse gases by 2050, and to set more ambitious targets for the more midterm period of 2030, which is to reduce between 50 and 55% of greenhouse gas gas emissions. So that's the main bit. Another element quite important, which sets the tone of the whole European Green Deal, is the strive to change the model of the economic growth. So since this is a growth, the European Green Deal is also regarded to be the growth model of the future. The European Union wants to settle the deal on the so-called circular economy. It wants to shift focus from a very linear model of industrial production and economy, which has dominated the economic field so far, and shift to circular economy. So what does that mean? That means that we rethink the way we produce, the way we distribute, and the way we expose of materials. So in the linear model, we had a principle where you use raw materials, you extract from the nature, you process, and you expose of garbage, of waste. With the new circular economy, this wants to be made away with. So we don't want to create waste. We want to produce sustainably. We want to have consumers that are acting sustainably and who do not dispose with waste, and who we want to have greater levels of renewables. We want to recycle more, and we want to recover secondary raw materials and set them again in motion and produce again without further extracting new materials and resources from the nature. So there is a clear cessation from the past, and the economic growth model wants to be decoupled from resource use. So we want to minimize the level of resources used in our economic growth. The third pillar is sort of more probably interesting to you as social democrats. It's about thinking about the Green Deal not just as a growth model, but about but it's also about thinking of the society and the way the society takes over the burden or doesn't take the burden of this green transition. So all of you are very familiar with what's been going on the last couple of years, and what for instance, in France, I hope we have some people from France attending today as well. You all know about the Yellow Vest movement, and why it started. So we want to start up the discussion about who is about to pay for this green transition. Are ordinary citizens the ones to bear the cost, and how do we integrate the concerns of small, regular people, middle class people who want to live sustainably, but maybe cannot afford to live sustainably. So the European Green Deal wants to discuss this issue. It wants to make the green transition work for everyone. It wants to put the people first. It has the ambition to include everyone in it, and to enable the society to live an affordable life, but also a sustainable life without bearing a great cost of it. So there are a lot of policies that have been implemented so far, where the cost of adaptation is shifted to the consumer. For instance, raising taxes and then being reflected in higher bills, higher electricity bills for citizens. For those of you from Germany, you might be well aware of the last couple of years and of the Energiewende, which has meant that the agenda of closing down some coal industries and nuclear energy, and concentrating more sustainable sources of energy and renewables has led to higher electricity prices, right? You could probably confirm that, which created a major uproar in the German public, I suppose. So we have to think about equitable transition, about just transition, and the European Union, with the European Green Deal, is trying to put in place a just transition mechanism by which it would compensate for, especially for those regions that rely more on classic fossil fuel industries to transform. So basically, the fund will distribute money to these regions in order for them to have a more to have a transition which is not too radical and which isn't too burdensome to these regions. So it enables these less developed regions to catch up more fastly without being compromised in their ability to grow their economy further. So there's a lot of things that have been discussed to enable a just transition. Some of them is also to enable, on the level of member states, that green investments are excluded from calculating public debt. So that's something that's currently being discussed as well. We'll see how that discussion goes on. About the policy substance of the European Green Deal, you see this is a depiction of all the policy areas that take an interest in the European Green Deal and which the European Green Deal tries to address. I'll go one by one, just briefly discuss them, all of them, and see what are the main highlights of each area where the European Union is trying to set the pace for the rest of the world. So again, just to remind you, if you look at the European Green Deal agenda, it is a integrated agenda. It is a mainstream agenda. It tries to mainstream the climate concerns and environmental concerns throughout all of these policy areas that are listed on this slide, as you can see. Just take a sip. So I'll just go briefly one by one, try to explain them and see what the ambition is. Just keep in mind all the things that I'll be discussing, they are currently just proposals. The European Commission is very ambitious in its scenarios for the future, but eventually it will have to be turned into EU legislation, and we know EU legislation has to be co-decided between the European Parliament and the Council, where member states have a lead say. So the level of ambition might at the end not be just the way the Commission thought it would be, but at least the ambition is set very, very high for the moment. So regarding climate neutrality, the European Commission is trying, and it already proposed, a so-called climate law, which should enshrine into a legislation the target to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And there's a big debate now whether there should be midterm reviews of individual member states' achievement of this goal. It's something that member states are some of the member states are likely to contest, others not. The EU, besides setting these new, more ambitious targets on climate, the European Commission is trying to set in new instruments to ensure climate neutrality. For instance, a new tax on carbon border tax, which tries to has the goal of avoiding industries heavy fossil fuel industries being moved out of the European Union into countries which have more favorable regulations on climate change. It wants to avoid that by imposing a climate border tax. It also wants to step up the activities on one aspect that has been neglected so far, which is climate adaptation. Climate adaptation strategies enable basically to adapt to the new reality that we won't be able to mitigate fully the extent of climate change, but we'll also have to adapt to the new reality of more droughts, of more floods, of more danger for our European islands, and for the othermost regions that are most affected by climate change. So new adaptation strategies will be developed, and the European Commission is trying to especially emphasize the aspect of more investment into innovative solutions in that regard. So one question in this aspect that might be interesting for you to discuss later on when you'll be in group work is to think about how climate adaptation and mitigation affects outermost regions and islands, the areas that are hardest hit by climate change, and what can we do about it? I know Frano will be mostly interested in that, I presume. And that would have been a topic to discuss on Brač if we had met there. Secondly, there is this agenda on energy policy, which is calling upon a decarbonized energy sector. You might be aware of something that's called the Energy Union in the European Union. It's an initiative to finally create synergy on the European energy market, in a sense to ensure that the European Union is energy secure, that it has enough energy by itself without having to rely on other providers of energy. It also means that there is great initiative to integrate the European energy market, because at the moment, just to give you an example, there's quite some problems in connecting different countries with energy pipelines and interconnecting facilities. For instance, if Spain is able to produce a lot of energy from wind or solar, it won't necessarily be able to export this energy over to France or Portugal and so, because this infrastructure is not overly developed, and there is this great initiative to increase the capacity of the European Union to interconnect different countries with energy. So far, you have the situation that you produce solar energy, but you have the double problem, the twin problem of not having enough technological advancements to store that sort of energy into maybe some batteries that would be able to store energy for a long time. This is a very mushrooming area of interest now. And secondly, you're not able to export it to other European Union countries. So this wants to be changed with this. A third dimension is basically to increase energy efficiency and decarbonize the energy sector, to rely more on renewable energy. And fourth, of course, to invest more into research and innovation in this regard. We know there's been big discussion on creating new technologies to store CO2 emissions underneath the ground, for instance. These are more radical and controversial topics. There is a debate going on that, whether it's good or not. But we have other discussions as well on smart grids, on energy storage, new batteries, and so on. So the EU is trying to pump in some money into the innovation and research area to look into these very promising areas. Let me discuss the circular economy and circular and clean industry a bit as well. Let's see, we have something on the chat. Okay, do you know how high? Well, there is a hydrogen. I'm not sure whether it's ready already, but the European Green Deal does emphasize highly hydrogen. It is on the agenda, but I think it's not necessarily in the it's something more long term, I think, to think about. But there is political commitment to that shift to hydrogen as well. The overall share, I would have to Google that, but it's higher than 20%. I would assume now. Depends on the country. Maybe some of you can Google it and write it down in the chat box as I continue speaking. Thank you for the question. So with regards to the circular economy, as I said, the usual model of extracting, processing, and disposing of material of disposing of material has to be ditched. It wants to be ditched, and there has been a lot of action already going on in this area of the circular economy. Already in 2015, there was a action plan by the Commission to address that. You might be familiar with the recent initiatives that will be implemented quite soon, like getting rid of single-use plastics. Plastic straws are going to become a thing of the past. Also, a lot of initiatives on the design of products have already been initiated in the last couple of years by the European Union in order to standardize the design of products and make them more nature friendly. You know that, just to give you an example, there's a big problem with products which combine different materials and which have different components, some of which are recyclable, others are not. So that creates a problem in the recycling stage. Okay, let me check whether you wrote something on the 19%. Okay, so with 2018, so I presume they somehow made it to 20% in 2020. So the overall goal was achieved. So again, going back to circular economy, issues that are discussed here are mostly focused on problems of producing, using, and recycling plastics. That's a big concern. As I said, single-use plastic will be phased out, and we already have provisions and targets on reducing waste levels, on municipal waste and landfills, as well as the targets on separate collection of waste as well. That's something that already is happening as we speak. But there is more ambition to it. The European Commission has set out an ambitious agenda to decarbonize the industry that relies heavily on fossil fuels, and to reduce the use of raw resources in industries like textile, plastics, electronics, and construction. So it wants to make sure that resources are used sparsely, sustainably, that sustainable resources are used, and recyclable resources are used. So the agenda wants to make sure that there's less waste created, that we have more sustainable products, and that we change some habits and enable the consumers as well to reap the fruits of more sustainable products. So here are often issues like, for instance, the right to repair a product pops up. So that's very high on the agenda of the European Commission, to enable ordinary citizens to have the right to repair a product without, facing a situation where 5 years from buying a product, there is no more replacement elements of a product to be found on the market. So that's a ridiculous situation in which you are then faced with the choice of either dumping this product and buying a new one, or facing very, very high costs to finding replaceable materials. So that wants to be changed as well. There will be a extended responsibility for producers to take in exposed products like a washing machine or like your phone. So there is great hope that producers, like say you have a iPhone or Samsung, that there will be a responsibility of the producer to take in at their cost the exposed mobile phone and to recycle it. So that's something that goes in the direction of reducing waste and recycling more. As well, also there will be a lot of emphasis is put on increasing the transparency and traceability of products, so that consumers know whether a product has been produced sustainably, and what's the life cycle of a product. Where does it end up when it's supposed to be disposed, and this sort of informed decisions that we as consumers can make is a great hope as a tool to incentivize the industry as well to move in that direction as well. So one question that you might ask yourself from a social democratic point of view when we speak about circular economy might be how to make sure that it's a inclusive transition, in a sense that we know that a shift to clean industry also means that some classical jobs will have to be closed. Some people will lose their jobs, and we want to make sure that the next generation of workers, and as well the current workers who lose their jobs, are able to catch up and find green jobs. The question is, how do we make that happen? And how do we make the transition from unemployment caused by the green transition to be as harmless as possible, that this transition from unemployment to employment is productive and that it bears the least possible. Just briefly about resource efficient housing. This is an agenda that is very familiar to you. What has changed here is the ambition again. There is intention to create a new wave of renovation, a new renovation wave, not just intended for public, but also for private buildings. So there's two tracks now, both public and private investment in resource efficient housing and buildings. The question that you might ask yourself here is, how do we make sure that this sustainable lifestyle of living and housing is affordable to the average citizen? So that's something to note as well for later. Mobility, eco-friendly mobility and transportation is a big issue as well. The EU wants to incentivize cleaner solution to mobility. Wants to invest into in more infrastructure for say recharging stations for electric cars. It wants to revise as well the targets, the CO2 emission targets for cars, which are currently in place, to make them more radical than currently. And it wants to, as a third maybe pillar, to incentivize people to, not just to incentivize people, but to incentivize governments to create a conducive environment for so-called multimodal transportation, which means that by using multiple modes of transportation, say railway, cycling at some point, and then switching maybe to tram at some point, might reduce several problems which create further problems for the nature, which is like congestions, which create a great toll for air quality and pollution, and these sort of things. So multimodal mobility is considered to be an answer to multiple problems of both reducing congestion, waiting times, but also pollution and other problems. And it also creates a more sustainable and reliable transportation system. Regarding agriculture, agricultural policy is already being greened. There is the so-called green direct payments in the agricultural sector, where farmers receive funding depending on how much they invest in environmentally friendly practices, in soil protection, use of pesticides, biodiversity, and different and these sort of things. What the new commission is trying to do now is to up again the ambition of this, to increase the proportion of green direct payments, but also to incentivize farmers to do more in terms of sustainability and sustainable farming by rewarding them more for doing good practices and eco-friendly practices. So there is a system now being developed, an eco scheme, which will try to make sure that we reward farmers for eco-friendly practices. And again, here the logic in the agricultural sector is again holistic, just as the European Green Deal as well is intended to be holistic. It means to impact the whole production cycle of food, so the whole food chain, from production to storage of food, to packaging of food, to transportation of food. So all of these elements are an important, can be an important stumbling block to more sustainable production and more environmentally friendly agriculture, but it also offers a great deal of room for improvement. Obviously, to create less waste, to preserve biodiversity by using less severe chemicals or less chemicals as such, to reduce the climate footprint of production, and so on and so forth. So the intention is to make the food chain more sustainable. Going to biodiversity, biodiversity and pollution already is a big topic, and has been a big topic on the EU agenda for a couple of decades now. But here again, the ambition is becoming bigger. The European Commission wants to increase the coverage, the area covered by the so-called Natura 2020 area, which is our protected areas within the European Union. It wants to increase that coverage, of course, to protect the biodiversity, and it also wants to invest more in so-called afforestation, as opposed to deforestation, of course. Investing more into replenishing and rebuilding our forests to be able to capture more of greenhouse gases. Also, it wants to reduce. The Commission wants to reduce pollution more by making the air quality standards more strict, and the monitoring of these standards more harsher. We're closing up with this slide by discussing clean technologies. Clean technologies are a big topic now, not just because of the digitalization transition and transformation, but also because it is a pertinent way of contributing to more sustainable. To a more sustainable future in all of these sectors that I've discussed so far. So you can think of the so-called Internet of Things. You can think about the 5G network, smart systems, and all these sort of sophisticated smart systems which rely on modern technologies to be able to contribute to more informed choices, to more sustainable, energy efficient production. So there's great investment now in new technologies of storing energies into batteries. Especially the battery industry will be incentivized with more funding, because we seem to be lacking behind in these areas too. there will be new ways of using technology to monitor the levels of waste, the levels of pollution. Technology will help us also optimize the use of energy, not just in the household, but also, in industry and in agriculture. Technology will also help us, create new climate adaptation techniques and technologies. It can help us transform the transportation system into making a more smart system where cars communicate mutually, where we have smart cities. It will also help us grow food more sustainably by creating a smart farming system. And to wrap up this section, before I ask you another round of questions, is also a very pertinent aspect from a social democratic point of view, because as I already mentioned, it will be very important to focus on the education system, on social policy and employment policy as a tool for achieving this double transition, green and digital transition. So a lot of money will be invested in reskilling and upskilling of workers, so that they can learn the new technologies that they will work on in the future. This is a necessity, of course, because with the new shifts, with the new green shift and digitalization, naturally, workers will have to adapt. We have to think about ways of how to achieve it in a most efficient way. And we have, of course, beyond the question of using labor market policies to make that transition more smooth, we have to think about how to ensure that we have job security for our workers. We have to think about how to make the transition from unemployment to employment more smooth, and we have to think about of course, the fair working conditions of work in this new society, be it of platform workers or be it workers who work in the green jobs of the future. So these are issues that are often put under the surface, but they have to resurface at some point, and maybe it's up to the social democratic cause to rally on that. Of course, just to mention, so where is the money coming from? I mean, it seems like a lot of to swallow, right? A lot of things to swallow. So the money has to be big, and the ambition of the Green Deal is exactly reflected in the intended financial firepower of the European Green Deal. It intends to mobilize around 1 trillion euros of investment. Of course, it's not the 1 trillion mark is not. It's not. It's the total sum that is aspired to be mobilized both by public and private investment. But the money which comes from the EU level will be drastically lower than that. This is the ambition of achieving 1 trillion, but the money from the budget will be somewhat lower. So there is, as I said, money from the EU funding. Will at least 25% will have to go into the European Green Deal. Let me just say, could you send the? Yes, we will send the presentation. No worries. Sorry. So the funding, of course, is very ambitious, but it will ultimately depend on the negotiations on the multi-annual financial framework of the European Union for the next 7 years. And this is something which we have to think about right now. Since we find ourselves in a very big crisis at the moment and have a lot of challenges ahead. Some of the more immediate challenges beyond the COVID-19 crisis is, first of all, even if there wasn't a COVID-19 crisis or a coronavirus crisis, we should have still asked ourselves whether EU leaders will actually put the money where their mouth is. So we saw that EU leaders, the European Council, has supported the European Green Deal cause. It has mandated the Commission to move in that direction. But the question is whether they are ready to really pump in the numbers to match the ambition with the numbers. We know so far from the discussions the last couple of months, it has been very hard. It has been very hard negotiations, and it's not going to become easier with negotiations after the COVID-19 crisis. So also, it will be, as always, a question of whether the Commission will be able to go beyond just non-binding strategies, roadmaps, initiatives, targets, and similar non-binding instruments. Whether it will be able to actually incentivize the Council and the Parliament to really come up with legislative hard law that will be implemented in member states. So what I wanted to discuss in the last 2 or 3 minutes is the fact that we have a corona crisis now, and that just a couple of months ago, it seemed as if the European Green Deal would be would give a new boost to the European economy and to the green and digital transition. That it will be something different from Europe 2020, which was a exit strategy from the crisis. The times, a couple of months ago, the times were radically different, as I said, and the feeling was that it's the best time to make these big changes and big decisions now. But and the multi-annual financial framework was the perfect instrument, the golden opportunity, if you wish, to up the game on the green transition. But now it seems that with the corona crisis and the fact that we still don't have the multi-annual financial framework agreed between member states, that now the multi-annual financial framework will become again a recovery program, an exit strategy from the corona crisis that we have at the moment. There's big debate going on now between different countries, the more frugal countries and the more cohesion oriented countries, the net recipients of EU funding, which say, just like some of the governments for instance, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, Hungary, even before they've been very skeptical of the European Green Deal. They have tentatively subscribed to it. Sum up the debate. It will be interesting to observe how the clash between the North and the South is going to work out, because a new rupture seems to be re-emerging, resurfacing. It seems to be exacerbating it again. The new member states will probably want to have more cohesion funding because of the COVID crisis now, and would like not to focus too much on the Green Deal. On the other hand, the signaling from the northern member states, but also from the European Council as well, has been more optimistic in that regard. Just a few weeks ago, actually a week ago, there was a European Council meeting which in its conclusions gave a clear commitment to the green transition. So leaders of member states are still very much attached to the cause. They say that we need to ensure a normal functioning, quote unquote, of our societies and economies, and to sustainable growth, integrating the green transition and the digital transformation. So EU leaders do give a tentative approval to the Green Deal despite the COVID-19 crisis, but many actors are very skeptical. Some of the European parties as well, the European People's Party, Some of the members of that party have been saying that we have to stop with current initiatives on so-called farm to fork strategy and sustainable agriculture, because farmers will be deeply affected by the current crisis, and they shouldn't bother with greening their farming practices and so on and so forth. Others have been calling upon different ways of dealing with the crisis. Some NGOs, some green NGOs have been saying that this is actually now an opportunity even more to stick to the cause and stand by it, and maybe even try to use leverage of the new financial tools that will be used at the EU level and funneled to member states to recover from the COVID crisis. They've been calling upon using these financial relief measures to attach them to so-called green strings, which means that to receive funding, you would have to subscribe to, changing your practices. For instance, if you have the aviation sector, or if you have the car industry, or any other industry that relies on fossil fuels and so on, and is in big trouble at the moment, some say and advocate that in order to receive, for instance, funding, subsidies from the governments, or or lending and loans from the European Investment Bank and from other sources, that they should be committed to moving away from fossil fuels to accelerate their transition to renewables. For instance, in the car industry, the conditionality that would be attached to that financial aid would imply that the car industry would have to accelerate its ambition to lower the CO2 emissions and to accelerate their transition to more electric and hydrogen-based vehicles. And the aviation sector as well, moving away from fossil fuels, using more of new technologies, exploring maybe hydrogen and aviation and so on. So there are two dimensions that you have to keep in mind when you think about it. But I suppose that is something that might pop up in your questions and thinking. Maybe as this brings us to the end of the presentation. As I said, at the end of the day, is the Green Deal a game changer, as I ask in the title of the presentation? Well, it is and it isn't. It is for its scope and depth of ambition. It has the potential to be a very great initiative in terms of legislation that will come out of it, and the financial power that will lie behind it, if it will. But on the other hand, it's not too much of a game changer in the sense of the paradigm. The paradigm shift, at least in the expert circles, in the Commission as well, everything has been there as well, has been there on paper, in policy thinking for the last decade or so. So in terms of the paradigmatic cocoon, the Green Deal is nothing new. It's nothing unexplored, but its ambition is quite highly set.